Now I'd like to introduce Richard Foy, the Chief Archivist Tumuaki Te Rua Mahara o Te Kāwanatanga from Archives New Zealand. Archives New Zealand is our nation's storehouse of memories and national archival institution. In this closing keynote, Chief Archivist Richard Foy will explore the intricate and sometimes fascinating connections between public archives, our sense of national and cultural identity, and the very intimate personal identities that we hold as individuals. He will discuss how the most public and banal of records held in our National Archive can unlock for us our most personal sense of who we are as individuals and as a nation. Without further ado, Richard, no mai haere mai.
Inga mana, inga reo, I rora inga tēnā mā tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko e te roa te whenua, ko rimotaka te moonga, ko rongorongo te awa, ko Wong Axel, Wong Jim, Wong Hingfong, toko te puna no heina ia. Ko Ngāti Siap, toko iwi, ko Wong Chun, toko hapu, ko Wong, toko whanau, ko Wong Guakwi, toko ingoa, tuturu, ko Richard Foy ahau. Ko o te tūmaki o te roa mahara o te kāwanatanga. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora. It's great to be giving the last address for today. I know that it's been a really grueling couple of days, and so I was having a talk to Tim Waldron yesterday. He's on the organising committee. He said that this needed to be an exciting closing keynote. And it would have to be entertaining. This is my most personal, most serious keynote I'm ever going to give, so we'll just see how it goes. Look, I don't know many of you. I maybe know maybe a handful of you at the most, but I was told by the organisers that you are a very intelligent and smart crowd. So I imagine that just by looking at me through the powers of your observation, you've already picked up a few telltale signs of where I'm from and who I am. There's some very obvious tells about me, you know, from my jet black hair. It used to be jet, but I'm aging now, so it's a little bit white. I've got a funny name. I've got sort of congenital short-sightedness. I've got a funny accent, some say. I'm a little bit geeky, but it's also this gentle slant of my hypnotic almond eyes. So I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to judge you for probably figuring out that you've got the measure of me, that you know where I'm from, and you should feel no shame. Because you would be right, I'm from Wainyamata. Actually, I was at dinner with people last night and they were talking about Wainyamata. I thought, I don't want to spoil that one. So there's a picture of Wainyamata just recently that I took when I went and visited. But it's an absolutely beautiful place. But that's me, that's all you need to know. My talk, Public Records, Private Lives. Now, when I prepared the slide and I saw the promotional material for this conference, I thought, ooh, I recognise her. I've seen her, and I'm pretty sure it's her. I've seen her somewhere before. Was it there? No, don't think so. No, too much hair, a little bit too accessorised. A little bit too hip and cool, so not there. Definitely not there. I had to Google it, actually. I've gone off Google. I'm using DuckDuckGo nowadays. And I did a bit of searching. I thought, look, I know there was a previous conference, Identity Conference, 2015. Found this, actually it's quite amazing, actually, it came up with Real Me. And had a little bit of a look. Let's see, it's going to scroll up eventually. There we go. And I was reading this little blurb on the web, and interestingly enough, in my role as general, I thought, oh, that's funny. I think I remember writing that, because indeed, I did. Well, that was me when I was in a different role, convening the earlier conference from about 4 years ago. So now I remember you, Cheryl. Hey Cheryl, how you going? Cheryl's been a big part of the Identity Conference for a very long time, but I think she wants her privacy respected as well. Now last time I was here, I didn't actually give a keynote address or anything, but I was leading one of the work streams, and it was the last time's conference was Enabling Digital Identity and Privacy in a Connected World. So very much about how identity might help enable better services and transactions in a digital world, but ensuring that we remain our private selves when we need to. I don't know if anyone came to that little bit of the introduction to that workstream, but it was videoed, and it's only about 10 minutes long. So we're going to watch it, but sped up. So did you get that? Because it was pretty dense, a lot of the stuff in there. But what it really ended up saying, at the end, my kind of conclusion before having the panel discussion is that, identity is really messy. And actually what I shared a little bit of in that talk, which I'm going to finish off in this keynote, is actually some of the messiness that sort of followed me in my life and in my identity. Because 4 years ago, I discovered that my father was an alien. And in fact, he wasn't just any old alien. He was a very special alien according to the Aliens Act of 1948. And that made me realise that I'm an alien baby, which I think is pretty magnificent. But I found this through the certificate of registration for my father upon his death and going through his belongings. And finding, not this kind of alien, by the way. More this kind of, not that kind of alien, but the kind of alien that's, not illegal, but an alien of our nation. So here's my father's registration booklet and a list of residential addresses and business addresses, a lot of addresses in there. And on the back of the registration is information about what this booklet means. It sort of says that, my father had to notify authorities within 14 days of changing home address or work address or employment. It also said that he must produce the certificate of registration to a constable if asked, and that he could be imprisoned for up to 3 months or fined up to £100 if he was not able to provide it or meet the provisions of the Act. Which made me kind of think, it's certainly not like living in Nazi Germany, clearly, but there are certainly some aspects that he lived under when he was in New Zealand, where he had that sense of weight of authority above him, which always made him very circumspect about who he was and who we were as a family. So what have I learned since 2015 till now? Actually, the one thing that's happened is I've developed some superpowers as the Chief Archivist of Archives New Zealand, a set of powers that are given to me under the Public Records Act. Very, very special powers, not important here today. But what I've discovered through the digital vaults of our National Archive, our Archives New Zealand, Te Mahara, I found some receipts. This is a receipt. It's a poll tax certificate receipt for a Wong Jim who came into New Zealand on the 29th of July 1907. There's his signatures. This is what it actually looked like, because what I found digitally were obviously digitised copies. So these are the physical copies of these receipts. On here we can see a little receipt number, 1568, for a poll tax levied at £100. Fingerprints, left hand, little finger, right ring finger, middle finger, index fingers, don't know where the thumb was, and Wong Jim's signature. And also what I found in our digital vaults was this magnificent photograph. So if it's not obvious already, this is my grandfather. My grandfather, Wong Aksor, or by his more common name, Wong Jim, who passed away about 15 years before I was actually born. But what this discovery led me to then follow on through is like, well, what's this thing about this sort of secret identity that I think my father has had all his life and that he's passed on to his sons and that I've passed on to my children? Because if you're astute enough, you would have looked at these identity documents or these evidence of identity, and seeing that, we kind of all look the same actually, I think, that two things kind of show up. The fact that we've got different surnames there and different names. And the fact that my father goes by the surname Foy and my grandfather went by the surname Wong. Wong does not equal Foy. Very strange. So this led to a WTF moment for me and my brothers, where we were really just trying to say what exactly, and it has actually been a lifelong question of my family and my brothers to my father, trying to understand what exactly is this? Because I think this is the perfect expression of our identity as whakapapa, or whakapapa as part of our identity, trying to understand where we've actually come from to find our place on this earth. It has a very strong connection to this archival notion of provenance, of records and archives, of understanding the point of origin for a record and its context at a point in time. So when we found out about the poll tax, and we found out about our grandfather who lived before any of my brothers and I were born, we discovered that at the convergence of two men's lives was my father. And in fact, it's Wong Jim and this other gentleman called Wong Kao Foy, where we get our surname from. So Wong Jim is my grandfather, my father's father. And in a great sort of misfortune, our grandfather looks like my brother Colin. It's very sad. Sad for my grandfather. And this gentleman, Wong Kao Foy, is not his real dad and not my real grandfather, but he's the man that I get my surname from. And so who was Wong Kao Foy? Well, he was also an alien. He was an alien. Through a little bit more research into the public records, we find out a little bit more about his private life. And we discover that he actually indeed had a son called Charlie Kao Foy, but it was not our father. It was merely someone called Charlie Kao Foy who my father borrowed or paid for the identity details of. Well, we actually believe that it was my grandfather that would have paid for those identity details. Simply to make it more straightforward for my father to come into New Zealand and probably avoid the poll tax, I guess. I guess nowadays we'd call that immigration fraud. Yeah. So my father always went by the name Charles or Charlie to all his friends, although in the Chinese community it was very much Wong Hing Fung. I discovered a little bit more by going through the records and the archives to look into my father's coming to New Zealand and then bringing my mother into New Zealand, where an extra bit of subterfuge appears. And in this statement by my father to the Levin police, to the constable of the Levin police, and probably back then and probably was a single policeman, he mentions being a market gardener and being in partnership with his brother, Victor Kao Foy. Now, Victor Kao Foy, we do know through other public records, is actually the son of Wong Kao Foy, but he certainly wasn't my father's brother, but he was, I guess, in conversations to the police. And then further on, another little bit of morsel about my father. He said, I've been educated in New Zealand and I've got into the New Zealand way of living, and the Chinese way of living does not appeal to me, which might be hard to explain why he played mahjong a lot with his Chinese friends. So I always found that rather interesting. And then, of course, here's the statement by Constable Gillespie, the Levin police constable, who wrote a little letter just attesting to my father's good character. So this applicant speaks the English language well, and like his brother, does not associate with the other Chinese families in the district. I don't know who he was playing mahjong with. And he is of the Christian faith, never went to church, and lives according to the New Zealand standards. He is a good worker and dresses well, which sometimes begs the question whether the records we have, whether they tell the lies that we want them to tell, or they're ever telling the truth. But yeah, so this is kind of seriously. But, to give Constable Gillespie his dues, he did say that my father was the type of applicant, in his opinion, is the better type of Chinese and a suitable type to become assimilated into the community. Thank you, Constable Gillespie. Now, I guess when I first read this, I was like, yeah, that's kind of funny. But I think after a while, it sort of settled in on me and made me sort of realise that back then, New Zealand was a little bit, as Taika Waititi would say, racist AF. And I have a little bit of experience of that myself when I grew up in Wainyamata, where quite often, I would go to school and be stopped in the streets or in the school playground and be often sort of, asked to join in a little bit of sing-song like Ching Chong Chinaman, usually followed up by an ah-so and a bow, which I never really quite understood. But anyway, that was just part of growing up. So for me, this discovering the very public records about my grandfather, about my father, my mother, their coming to New Zealand, their finding a way of finding their identities, and in fact with my father having a very secret identity or dual identities, has been a big part of my journey over the last 5 years of trying to understand who am I. Who am I, by the way, is a Unix command, and it's just a nerdy thing, you don't need to worry about that. But this notion of identity of self has become really, really strong for me. Like, who am I? And who gets to say who I am? You might have heard of Carmen Rupe, who was a transgender icon or an LGBTIQ plus icon. I'm kind of almost losing touch on all the initials. But she was the very first person, I believe, in the world, if not the New Zealander, to have as her gender or sex on her passport a dash. I think it was in 1982 when she was making an application for a new passport. She actually asked to actually have no gender on her passport. And the ICAO standards allowed for this. It couldn't obviously be done, and I'm not sure what the current legislation is around her birth certificate or any other evidence of identity. But that one public statement of a passport where it allowed her to withhold her gender, her sex for a time, was really, really meaningful for her. And it reminded me when I was looking into this that in 1893, after the women's suffrage petition was successful, that women were included as in the definition of a person. But only if they were 21 or over, only if they were not convicted of a crime, and only if they were not an alien. That's right, an alien. So my dad, for much of his life, may have been a non-person. So Carmen Rupe, fantastic icon. And when I sort of think, well, who am I? Well, you heard me say before, ko Wongokfi toko ingoa tuturu. That's my true real name based on my grandfather. But I'm also Richard Foy in my everyday life, and I'm quite happy just to be called Richard. Yeah, that was a photo. That's my photo of my passport. It didn't come from MCH. Sorry, that was probably a bit too soon, wasn't it? I got an email as part of the conference asking me this fantastic question, which I thought was really fun. Who gets to decide who you are? And I think this was probably a discussion in the last couple of days. And I thought it's a fantastic question to be actually asking yourself. I think you probably have heard about Shoshana Zuboff and her book, Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I don't know if that's been much of a topic of discussions in the last couple of days, but it's this notion that maybe it's not Big Brother in terms of the state that is interested in you and identifying you and setting your identity, but maybe it's actually the surveillance capitalists, the big tech organizations who are most interested in your identity. And in fact, if you read the book, and I think I made the mistake of reading the book on holiday. It's probably not the best holiday reading. But if you do read the book and get to towards the end of it, you understand that her thesis is that it's not about taking identity. In fact, they don't even care about us. It's about producing models of prediction based on our actions and our activities. And to me, that is the greatest withdrawal of my sovereign rights and my sovereign identity, my ability to have agency in my future to make my own decisions and to be able to control what I'm going to do in the future. I don't need other people predicting that for me, thank you very much. So if the tech giants and the surveillance capitalists are asking, who are you, and I'm asking, who am I think it does kind of beg the question, and certainly as the head of archives, who are we? Because I'd really hate to think that we are defined by these guys. It makes me cry. I'd hate to think that our nation is defined by a loss on a cricket field. That's maybe too soon. So who are we? What I'm going to show is like a 90-second clip of probably one of New Zealand's most iconic films, and I'm not talking Lord of the Rings. I've edited it just for this, so just so you get the most impactful bit, but I just want you to watch this. Wow. Don't know if any of you have seen that before, whether you've even seen that in person. It is a short film. It's one of the most iconic New Zealand short films called This Is New Zealand. It was produced for the Osaka Expo of 1970 by the National Film Unit, directed by a gentleman called Hugh MacDonald. And it was lovingly restored through archives, working with Park Road Post, I think back in 2007. And it is it's a remarkable film. I've only shown you 90 seconds of it. It shows many different aspects of New Zealand's society at the time, obviously in 1969. And Osaka Expo, like many World Expos, was I think a 6-month exhibition which showcased many nations. It told the stories of hundreds of nations around the world. This is a New Zealand one.
Inside the pavilion entrance, visitors may be lucky enough to be given a Kiwi badge. These are keenly sought after, for such souvenirs are truly popular with the Japanese.
Did we get a Kiwi badge for this conference? We need a Kiwi badges are very good. So yeah, this. Oh, sorry, is this right? It's just the end of this. A little bit of here. This is the end bit. This is New Zealand. Yeah. So This Is New Zealand as a short film got shown to probably like 2 or 3 million visitors of the Osaka Expo in Japan. And then it got shown to, I think, close to 350,000 New Zealanders when it was showcased back home here in New Zealand, probably in 1970, 1971. And here are some photos of, again, from the National Archives, from the National Publicity Studios, some of the setup. So busloads of New Zealanders would be bussed into Wellington. I think it also happened up in Auckland. There's the embassy. This one would have been, I think, the Cinerama on Dixon Street. Hundreds of people just pouring in. Old ladies, children of all colours and races. This is New Zealand. So it was an opportunity for lots of New Zealanders from different walks of life to experience that view that we were portraying on the global stage in Osaka. So this was New Zealand, was the name of it. I think in many ways this was New Zealand because it was obviously a snapshot in time in 1970. And it's a New Zealand that was created and founded on some very important documents. I'm going to show whiz through about 179 years here of a story of a very important document for our identity, and that's Te Tiritia Waitangi. But it's not the historical story, it's the archival story. This is just going to zip by real quick, so close your eyes if you don't like fast movement. Because there's a very long 179-year archival story for how this document's been looked after and tended to by not just government but also by my institution, Archives New Zealand. And I think it's very much an expression of identity as an iconic thing or as an icon, much like that This is New Zealand film. It's now seen to be such an important document that we're finally taking good care of it, and we're putting it together with a declaration, He Whakaputanga, the Te Tiriti, and the Women's Suffrage Petition as the three most significant, iconic constitutional documents that have really founded New Zealand in terms of our culture, society, our government. On these documents are not just a few signatures, but in fact with the suffrage petition we've got thousands, tens of thousands of signatures of tohu, of marks of our tupuna, who literally thought it was worthwhile to write their names and their marks on these documents because they hoped for a different or better New Zealand than the one they were living in. And those are the sorts of stories which are now shaping our sense of identity of who we are today. It reminds me of my grandfather Wong Jim, who never got to sign any of those documents, and we have no forebears who signed them. But his tohu on that poll tax certificate is also, I think, a sign of his obligation and his commitment to the story of this nation. And if you get the chance, I encourage you to go down to the National Library on Molesworth Street, and you can actually go have a look at these very iconic expressions of our shared identity in He Tohu, a permanent exhibition. It's absolutely beautiful. But here's another expression of ourselves and who we are. And it's an identity kind of document. It's actually a passport application for one of the most iconic heroes of our nation, and that's Sir Edmund Hillary. And it was found about the same time as the passport application for his dear friend, George Lowe. And these two passports applications were issued or applied for in around 1950, just a few years before the expedition to the Himalayas where he ascended Mount Everest. So it's an amazing find in our National Archives. Now normally we don't actually keep these types of applications, they're just things that do get thrown away, but clearly someone in Internal Affairs saw these and thought, these are really kind of remarkable. We need to actually hold on to these, we need to remember them. We've got a passport application here for George Napier, one of our great rugby players. Some Kirita Kanawa, Inia Tiwiata, one of the great singers. Dame Whina Cooper. So we don't just have records of words of them, we have photographs, we've got motion, audio-visual materials. So amazing sorts of things that we keep in the National Archives. We've got memories of some great statesmen of New Zealand. And we've got pictures of the Papakura post office cat. I like cats, yeah, by the way. And there's cultural aspects to who we are, like split ends. So there's an amazing archival record we have about an application by Split Ends to get $5,000 worth of funding. And a letter from Tim just saying, thanks guys for the $5,000. And then another letter saying, oops, sorry, we didn't write to say thanks on our record cover, and we'll get that sorted in the next couple. So it's this incredible ephemera. But sometimes our nation and who we are and identity is expressed through the tragedies that we feel and that we have experienced. In this case, the Tongarewa disaster, the worst train disaster in New Zealand's history on Christmas Eve, 1953. And so, you know, photographs of the scene which really capture what was going on. Or another tragedy, this is a Navy situation report that happened, that was produced and that we have in our archives regarding the Erebus disaster. And it's just interesting sometimes reading these records and understanding them. I mean, words here like Air New Zealand Flight 901 has failed to acknowledge radio transmissions. Awareness, initial action and planning phase completed in accordance with NWP 37B. 1 LC-130 fixed wing aircraft and 2 UHIN rotary wing aircraft are preparing to launch for search and rescue effort. And then a little bit down there, loss damage not known at this time. Remarks, anticipate worldwide press interest. Press release to follow. So these again, public records which give us an insight into a moment in time. And of course we don't have information, we don't have publicly available information about the actual victims of Erebus that we make available because those are actually protected for 70 years. And we will never be able to listen to the cockpit voice recorder even though those are under my care as Chief Archivist. Due to international convention, we never listen to those. But those records become other records, such as the air accident investigation records, and the middle one by Chief Inspector of Air Accidents Chippendale, who then got engrossed in a tussle of words and ideas, I guess, with Judge Mann in the actual inquiry. Sometimes the much more public tragedies that we recall and that we remember and that we keep records of, like the Hawke's Bay earthquake. And here's a condolence telegram from the Governor-General and the Queen. And this I thought was rather interesting. A minute from the Prime Minister's office at the very first meeting about a week after the earthquake, which was really just saying, hey, a big thing's happened. There's not going to be enough money to fix everything. We need to prioritise. And you can imagine countless times those kinds of conversations being had in numerous Prime Minister's offices over the decades. But then we get reminded of the very personal impact, such as on the very right, where we have a list of people's actual properties and the damage that was caused through that earthquake. We sometimes remember who we are through our experiences of conflict. In this case, I've got some things here about World War I and going to Gallipoli and Anzac Cove. And some of those things come from very public records again. In this case, the unit diaries or divisional diaries of the armed forces. And here's one that, if we bring it up here, you know, it's not particularly personal when you read it, but when you read about places that you've heard, like Lonesome Pine, Quinn's Post, Johnson's Jolly, Pope's Hill, it brings you from today and takes you back to yesteryear and helps you understand a little bit of maybe what soldiers actually experienced in the trenches and in that warfare in that time. And you start to realise that these actually have very, very personal impact on people. And we start to also see some other things about some soldiers we maybe never even knew about. World War II is an interesting thing with the war art collection that the National Archives holds, because it's a different way, again, of actually understanding who we are, not through very detailed records or photographs, but through artistic impressions. So here are some really iconic McIntyre photos about the attack on Monte Cassino, which are kind of very, very somber. And then, you know, there's some war art which is actually pretty jolly. But some of what New Zealand experiences and who we are is expressed not just in our conflict abroad, but probably more importantly in the conflict at home. And here's an example, there was a report about an attack on Bulcott Homestead written by some New Zealand soldiers, government soldiers, and Bulcott Homestead out in Lower Hutt. a letter from a Māori chief imploring North Island chiefs not to do anything that was going to make life difficult for them, which is interesting. And then, a prisoner list, 1 of 9. So there's hundreds of names here of prisoners from the New Zealand Wars. And then a proclamation to, basically a wanted poster for Hona Hiki after he had cut down the flagpole once or twice. And then sometimes we think about that expression as it moves forward in time. Here's some records from the Māori Land March in 75. You may recognise those. But then the very public expression of that land march through the petitions that were actually presented to Parliament. And I don't remember that so much, but I do remember the Springbok tour, and there was a huge campaign to send postcards to the Prime Minister and to express our displeasure at the Springboks actually coming to New Zealand. Now, some of what we remember of New Zealand is probably a lot more fanciful, so those are very serious things. Here's the Beatles. This was before I was born. I just noticed this today when I was looking at it. There's a really big ticky there. I actually don't know which one of the, all white people look the same to me, so I don't really know which. Expression of New Zealand, which harks back to that, this is New Zealand, great pictures of New Zealand, and then these wonderful posters from the rail service who are trying to get across how beautiful New Zealand is, how easy it is to travel to by rail. But then sometimes we remember that actually just a lot of sheep in New Zealand. But don't feed your sheep to the dog and let your child play with the dog because you might get high daddits. So these are a public health record. Sometimes we remember our country and who we are through some of the things we're a little bit ashamed of, or very ashamed of, like the way we treat those who have mental illness, and that's an ongoing issue. This is a picture of Seacliff Lunatic Asylum down in Dunedin, and it is frankly one of the scariest photos I think we've got in the archives, just by that it looks like a thing straight out of a horror show. And then the quirky things that tell us about who we are, a nation who was actually liked ferrets. So this is asking the government whether we'd like to buy 60 ferrets, very high-class ferrets. And then a subsequent letter a number of months later asking whether the government would like to release about 200 or 300 ferrets, high-class ferrets, by the way, and to Southland to get rid of the rabbit problem. Not a good idea. Or just working life, like a whole bunch of posties down in Christchurch in 1900, and the fact that if you've got a lot of bicycles, you need a bike shop. New Zealand's very first cell phone tower. Who would have thought? Well, these wonderful pictures of a more caring New Zealand, the Karatani service. These wonderful photos of and records of nurses looking after small New Zealand children. A letter to the government petitioning to look at the threat that comics and comic books, graphic novels, have on moral delinquency, when actually this is what moral delinquency probably looked like, a bunch of kids at the milk bar. Again, another photo from archives. Very early record of our air traffic control system. And who did they look after? Well, they controlled flights that were attended to by women, dressed in absolutely beautiful uniforms back in the day when it was National Airways Corporation. So I'm not too sure why we've got these in the National Archives, but they're absolutely fantastic expressions of who we were. And then, I don't know, was it the 60s or 70s happened? And and then they went really crazy. So I don't know. But anyway, so that what's in our archives, what's in these public records are very much just expressions of who we are and who we were, of everyday life. This is probably the last one of these ones I'll show. I love these because look at the dogs and look at that guy. He's got kind of same hair. This was New Zealand. And who are we? Watch this. Oh, Jennifer. So how do you feel? Because after I've shown you a lot of those records, because they're actually archives and some of them are There are obviously different artefacts, some of it's videos, some of it's photos, some of the things that are expressions of probably national sadness, of great shame, some of them of utter joy. Some of those images and artefacts will have made you think. I think the idea of asking ourselves, who are we, is about asking ourselves those questions and working them out. And I think about identity and national identity very much as it's our way of telling the best story of ourselves. Not necessarily the stories of our best selves. Sometimes very much, as you saw, it's the stories of ourselves when we were not our best, when we were at our very worst. But it's the best stories of ourselves and the hopes and the dreams and aspirations that we have that we might become our better selves in the future. But it only works if we think about identity as having an aspect of memory about it. One of my, it's just a terrible film, this version, Ghost in the Shell. This film which had Scarlett Johansson playing a character who was constantly grappling with what her memory was and what she remembered of her childhood, but her very sense of identity being played upon by the notion of what she was remembering over time. You should watch the anime film. It's much, much better than the Hollywood version. But it brings to me this idea that, yeah, memory in many ways is part of my identity. And if that's the case, then looking after that memory is incredibly important. And why? Well, I think, if we, in the case here, I've got some stuff here about World War I, clearly, the past, which we then use, and it was only 4 years ago that we celebrated World War 100, but without the past we can't actually have much of a present, and we certainly can't think much forward in terms of what the future might actually be about. And I do wonder what World War 200, what those commemorations will be like. What are the different stories we might tell in 2115 about what World War I was like than what we were told in 2015. So it's very important that we remember. And certainly as a National Archival Institution, we worry about forgetting things because we know that when we don't remember things, and this happens when we lose records or records deteriorate and are inaccessible, then we find that our sense of who we are today very much dims, and that has a really, really detrimental effect on our ability to think about ourselves and tell our stories of ourselves for the future. And that's why I think about identity really not just as a thing. I certainly think that identity is far more than just a bunch of data that surrounds me and follows me across the internet. It's far more than all the biometric markers around me. I think of it also as a right, and I'm sure that was being spoken of in the last couple of days. I don't know if you know what that is. It's not a robot. This is one of the Buddhas of Bamiyan, very tall Buddha statue in Afghanistan. If you know much about the history of this, that's what it looked like in 1963, and in 2000 the Taliban removed it. Because what we know is that when nations and sovereign states are invaded, when people are colonised, that one of the very first things that are done is to remove memories of the past, to remove memory of the people, of the land, so that new stories can be told and old stories can be forgotten. You see it all the time in science fiction as well, things like Fahrenheit 451, even The Handmaid's Tale, about rewriting of stories. 1984, about telling different truths, dealing with things like doublespeak and newspeak. Doublethink and newspeak. Now, this happened for us in New Zealand not that long ago, not intentionally. So this is the Hope Gibbons building where actually many records of government were held. And in 1952, a major fire took place, which destroyed many, many records across central government. So there were records from the Department of Native Affairs, from Maritime Services, local government records. The memory of vast amount of government departments were lost in that fire. And it was the event that led our government to say, we need to take care of our national identity and the evidence of our government, and therefore the Archives Act of 1957 was created. And then that became the Public Records Act of 2005. So we still have some survivors from then. And one of the sort of great historians of New Zealand, John Beaglehole, he wrote a little comment about this. Till we convert our scattered, rat-ravaged records into a proper system of archives, our claim to civilization is so much more the slender. We have hacked at the tree of our tradition with the murderous inconsequence of adolescent vandals in a public park. I mean, that's beautiful writing. I don't think anyone writes like that anymore, but he was a historian, so amazing. Because archives and archival institutions are actually having to protect against a whole bunch of threats to our right to identity through records and artefacts. And there's this thing called the agents of deterioration, which Te Tiriti has actually suffered. So that's what it looks like today, pretty much, if you go to He Tohu. Back in 1887, it was actually an extant record. But over time, it has been ravaged by rats, by poor humidity, by rain, and terrible storage conditions. And in fact, it was in 1908 that Thomas Moreland Hocken actually discovered Te Tiriti in the basement of the old government buildings, apparently in a heap of old papers and rubbish, in a terrible state, of which it had suffered water damage, pestilence, temperature, relative humidity, but probably the most egregious agent of deterioration was custodial neglect or dissociation, where we had ceased to care for this very important taonga, which was a taonga of our nation's identity. My institution feels this very deeply. So when He Tohu was actually opened, we had to move to Tiriti and He Whakaputanga and the Women's Suffrage Petition from Archives New Zealand to the National Library on Molesworth Street. It's only about 100 or so metres, but an incredible amount of care, of custodial care and archival care went into the movement. In the very early hours of April the 22nd, it moved from archives under the care of our people with mana whenua helping us do all the right things in the movement of those very precious documents, those taonga, from one home to a new home where they now live today. And it's interesting because I've got this question, a new identity, I'm almost done. There are still people in Archives New Zealand who feel a great sense of mourning and loss at those documents moving from Mulgrave Street to Molesworth Street. And although they remain under my statutory care as Chief Archivist and under the care of my people through the Public Records Act, that sense of dissociation, of loss and of a change in identity is very, very, very deeply felt by some people. And it's just sort of shown to me that, yeah, it's not simply the things that we believe and think, but it's the things we hold as well that can make a difference to our identity. We hope to have a little bit of new identity ourselves in the very near future. So this is our current building, our whare taonga on Mulgrave Street. It didn't quite turn out like the artist's impression had in the 70s. It was opened, actually would have been in the late 80s, so it was opened in 89, 1990. I think it was very much fashioned on sort of Soviet-era apartment block. But it is the home of countless records and countless items of New Zealanders and their identity and the identity of our nation. And inside these buildings, which are climate controlled and temperature controlled, humidity controlled, light controlled, secure, millions, literally millions of records. But that one's had better days. So we are hoping very soon, maybe in a few years' time, in 5 years' time, that we might get a new whare taonga. And you might have seen some stuff in the media recently about that. So yes, I'm just going to finish off here in terms of identity as future, because all of this, I believe, whether we talk about personal identity or identity of a nation, is about actually having the sovereignty and the agency to make those choices and decisions which affect our future. It's about not giving that up to the surveillance capitalists who are going to predict what I'm going to do, but actually taking hold of those, having the decision rights to make those decisions myself. And we have those rights as a nation, we have those rights as individuals. And I believe that I have that right myself. So who am I? Well, ko Wongwokfi Tokaunga Tuturu, ko Richard Foy aho. But if I want to change my name and my gender any time in the future, I also reserve that right for myself. And if I want to be an alien child, I will be that as well. And if I just want to be a geek, then I'll do that. Thank you. Thank you.
As a keeper of Tonga,
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was amazing, Richard. Thank you very much. And I just said to him quietly, but I'll share for the audience, as a keeper of some of our most precious tonga of our nation, I was really privileged to give him a tonga as well to say thank you for your presentation. Well, e hoa mā, we are now in the final wrap-up stage of our event. Now, actually, Richard, before you do disappear, there were some wonderful comments here. One question is, would you like to share your opinion on the value and risks of DNA testing through Ancestry.com?
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of DNA sharing, I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, this was asked of me yesterday, actually. No, it was asked of me by someone from the New Zealand Society of Genealogists a couple of weekends ago after I gave a talk there, and they said, Richard, you've discovered all this stuff about your family history. Why don't you send your DNA to the... And they didn't say whom. And I said, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to give away, my most precious biometrics and, parts of my identity to a business or a corporation that I don't know what they're going to do it with? I guess if a police person asked me for it, I would do that, but, because the state might need it for evidence, whatever. But I wouldn't give it away otherwise.
And that last question at the bottom. Oh, sorry. Where is it?
Oh, it disappeared.
Oh, it said, what were the challenges, digital challenges, how does that present? Oh, there you go.
Oh, yes.
Digital records archivist. Thank you.
Manifest, many, myriad. What I would suggest you do is you actually look for a fantastic article that was in stuff.co.nz on the weekend, which is about our sister institution and my friends at the National Library of New Zealand, where it talks at very great length by an investigative journalist around digital archiving and archiving of the web. So it's absolutely fantastic article, because you actually start to understand the very difficult problems we have about archiving anything that's out there on the internet. And even when we digitise things, I can speak for our institution, we don't throw them away, so we hold on to the physical in perpetuity. So I sort of think that Archives New Zealand is literally a growth business, which is not a good thing in government. We hold on to paper, we hold on to the digital, and it's a huge challenge because it doesn't get any cheaper either.
All right. Well, wait, Te Paki whānau. Thank you, Richard.
Good.
Awesome.